Hello everyone from northern Michigan. If you, like me, had not heard much about the joyous background of land-grant universities, well, congratulations! You and I can sit down and get some enlightenment. I actually read this earlier this morning, which is kind of a plus because I'll be able to skip over the parts that actually repeat each other. But I'm also kind of working under a deadline because I have a package to mail. So without too much further ado, don't be too intimidated by the length. A lot of it is images. So let's talk about land grab universities. Expropriated Indigenous land is the foundation of the land-grant university system by Robert Lee and Tristan Ahtone. I'm going to officially give a blanket apology now for anybody's community name that I mispronounce, because I'm sure I'm going to do some. Feel free to correct me. It's not because I don't like you. It's because I sometimes just can't pronounce things. Also doesn't help that I have mid-word dyslexia, so if I totally screw up your community's name, please know it's not because I don't like you. Alright, on August 29th, 1911, a Yahi man known as Ishi came out of hiding near Earlville, California. He had spent decades evading settlers after the massacre of his community in the 1860s, and recently lost the last of his family. Whisked off to the University of California's Anthropology Museum, he was described by the press as the last wild Indian. Ishi spent his final years living at the museum. When he wasn't explaining his language to researchers or making arrow points for visitors, he swept the floors with a straw broom as a janitor's assistant. And in return, he was paid $25 a month by the same university that sold thousands of acres of his people's land out from under him while he hid in forests and river canyons. Ishi may be known in Indian country and to California public school students, but his story remains mostly obscure, though considerably less so than the millions of acres of indigenous land sold to endow land-grant universities of the United States. In 1862, Abraham Lincoln signed the Morrill Act, which distributed public domain lands to raise funds for fledgling colleges across the nation. Now thriving, the institutions seldom ask who paid for their good fortune. Their students sit in halls named after the Act's sponsor, Vermont Representative Justin Morrill, and stroll past panoramic murals and embody creation stories that start with the gifts of free land. Behind that myth lies a massive wealth transfer masquerading as a donation. The Morrill Act worked by turning land expropriated from tribal nations into seed money for higher education. In all, the act redistributed nearly 11 million acres, an area larger than Massachusetts and Connecticut combined, which is pretty freaking mind-blowing. But with a footprint broken up into almost 80,000 parcels of land scattered mostly across 24 western states, its place in the violent history of North American colonization has remained comfortably inaccessible. So over the past 2 years, High Country News, which is where this is from, has located more than 99% of all Morrill Act acres, identified the original indigenous inhabitants and caretakers, and researched the principal raised from their sale in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. We reconstructed approximately 10.7 million acres taken from nearly 250 tribes, bands, and communities, with over 160 violence-backed land cessations, a legal term for the giving up of territory. Our data shows how the Morrill Act turned indigenous land into college endowments. It reveals two open secrets. First, according to the Morrill Act, all money made from land sales must be used in perpetuity, meaning those funds still remain on university ledgers to this day. And secondly, at least 12 states are still in possession of unsold Morrill acres as well as the associated mineral rights, which continue to produce revenue for their designated institutions. The returns were stunning. To extinguish indigenous title to land siphoned through the Morrill Act, the United States paid less than $400,000, but in truth it often paid nothing at all. Not a single dollar was paid for more than a quarter of the parcels that supplied the grants. The land confiscated through outright seizure by treaties that were never ratified by the federal government. From the University of Florida to Washington State, from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology to the University of Arizona, the grants of land raised endowment principal for 52 institutions across the United States. So the Morrill Act gave almost 80,000 parcels of indigenous lands, totaling about 10.7 million acres. Yep. To 52 land-grant institutions that found their endowment, and in Gage County, Nebraska, 40% of the land was given to Morrill Act parcels, second highest amount of any county. The lands were acquired through the June 3rd, 1825 treaty with the Kaw. The Treaty of 1837 contributed 1 million acres, more than any other land cessation, to 33 LGUs. The result for them was 3.2 million paid to their endowments, the highest profit grant from any one cessation. And in the midst of the violence known as the Mariposa War, 6 tribes signed a treaty on March 19, 1851 for land at the heart of gold mining territory. About 20% became Morrill Act grants, the highest percentage of any single cessation. Like all California treaties, it remains unratified. And I will leave you to appreciate the map later. So 2 land-grant universities and their Morrill Act parcels. So we have like the paths connecting the institution to the parcels. So we have some nice stats there in Cornell, which has like a huge amount of parcels relative to where it is. By the early 20th century, the grants had raised $17.7 million for university endowments, with unsold lands valued at an additional $5.1 million. If those sound paltry to dare, bear in mind that places like the University of Nebraska-Lincoln matriculated just 20 students to its first class in 1869. Contemporaries not only welcomed the grants as a very munificent endowment, they competed to acquire them to found new colleges or stabilize existing institutions. The money provided interest, income, inspired gifts, and boosted local economies, which is why a 2014 study called it the gift that keeps on giving. Altogether, the grants, when adjusted for inflation, are worth about $500 million. Chances are you have heard land acknowledgements recited at many of these universities, formal statements that recognize Indigenous peoples who formerly possessed the land these colleges now stand on. What many of these statements miss is that land-grant universities were built not just on Indigenous land, but with Indigenous land. It's a common misconception, for instance, that the Morrill Act grants were only used for campuses. In fact, the grants were as big or bigger than major cities and were often located hundreds or even thousands of miles away from their beneficiaries. Now, that was the thing I didn't know. Like, I know that we fought and took land away from people, but I didn't realize, like, the land-grant acts were not just for the campus. I had always assumed they were just the campus. I didn't realize they were doing all this speculation, as we shall see. So this is the first of many photographs, and because they're estimated, I'm not going to read all of them to you, but all of these go through like where they're at, the ID, the Indigenous caretaker names, the seizure, who the institution that was granted to, and who the benefit of, what we paid for it, us white folk, and the amount raised for the university. So I'm not going to go through too many of those, just because there's a lot of them. Today, these acres in the landscape of the United States form the landscape of the United States. On Morrill Act lands there now stand churches, schools, bars, baseball diamonds, parking lots, hiking trails, billboards, restaurants, vineyards, cabarets, hayfields, gas stations, airports, and residential neighborhoods. In California, land seized from the Chumash, Yokuts, and Kintanimuk tribes by unratified treaty in 1851 became the property of the University of California, is now home to the Directors Guild of America. In Missoula, Montana, a Walmart supercenter sits on land originally ceded by the Penn de Orel, Salish, and Kootenai to fund Texas A&M. In Washington, Duwamish land transferred by treaty benefited Clemson University, is now home to the Fort Lawton Post Military Cemetery. That's got to be weird. Meanwhile, the Duwamish remained unrecognized by the federal government despite signing a treaty with the United States. Recent investigations into universities' ties to slavery provide blueprints for institutions to reconsider their histories. Land acknowledgements furnish mechanisms to recognize connections to Indigenous and dispossession. Our data challenges universities to reevaluate the foundations of their success by identifying nearly every acre obtained and sold, every land seizure or treaty made with the land's Indigenous caretakers, and every dollar endowed with profits from dispossession. Unquestionably, the history of land-grant universities intersects with that of Native Americans and the taking of their land, said the Association of Public and Land-Grant Universities in a written statement. While we cannot change the past, land-grant universities have and will continue to be focused on building a better future for everyone. I like that tree. So yeah, here's the cemetery. That's gotta be weird seeing other people's dead buried on your ancestral homelands. Right? Right? So yeah, they paid like $4 and managed to get $60. Woohoo. A few years have mattered more in the history of U.S. real estate than 1862. In May, Abraham Lincoln signed the Homestead Act, which offered farmland to settlers willing to occupy it for 5 years, which was considered a great thing and billed as such in most mid-20th century classrooms. 6 weeks later came the Pacific Railway Act, which subsidized the Transcontinental Railroad checkerboard-shaped trains. Those I remember because it literally looked like a checkerboard next to, like, next to each railway line. Like, you get half and the community gets half, and somehow it works out. The very next day, on July 2nd, 1862, Lincoln signed an act donating public lands to the several states and territories which may provide colleges for the benefit of agriculture and mechanic arts. Contemporaries called it the Agricultural College Act. Historians prefer the Morrill Act after the land's law's sponsor. The legislation marked the federal government's first major foray into funding for higher education. The key building blocks were already there. A few agriculture mechanical colleges existed, as did several universities with federal land grants, but the Morrill Act combined the two on a national scale. The idea was simple: aid economic development by broadening access to higher education for the nation's farmhands and industrial classes. Which makes sense, except we have to kick a bunch of people out of there. How we investigate it, so, look at all these exciting documents. In the North, we are in the heyday of industrialization, the maturing of American capitalism. And the land grant, like other kind of acts, the Homestead Act or the creation of the Department of Agriculture, any of these types of activities that happened during this time, are really part of an effort in creating this modern apparatus for the state. So Nathan Sorber for the book Land Grant Colleges and Popular Vote. Land grant institutions can be understood as part of an effort to modernize the economy. The original mission was to teach the latest in agricultural science and mechanical arts, so it had this kind of applied utilitarian vibe to it, said Sorber, but the Act's wording was flexible enough to allow classical studies and basic science too. With the nation in the midst of the Civil War, it also called for instruction in military tactics. So this is a lovely infographic they made up, so yeah. I'm reading most of this, so I don't think you're missing anything, but yeah, some was taken through treaty. So yeah, the grants were offered roughly in proportion to the size of estates, non-Indigenous people, aka the white folk, granted parcels, and again, these are like the two. So Western states got to select parcels from their own borders using land agents. Eastern, Southern, and some Midwestern states were given acreage in the form of scrip, which is just sort of trading of value, which can be redeemed anywhere in the surveyed public domain. And the thing that we're going to find out more about is actually there are a whole bunch of parcels that are not sold, still being retained by these universities, as well as the fact that their mineral rights and other rights are retained for parcels they have sold. So yeah, by the early 1900s, we distributed 10.7 million acres for 52 endowments worth 22.8 million in principal and unsold holdings. All right, so the Act promised shares between, or states between 90,000 and 990,000 acres based on the size of their congressional delegation. In order to claim a share, they had to agree to conserve and invest the principal. Eastern states had no land in the public domain, as well as Southern and some Midwestern states received vouchers, known as the time at scrip, for selection of Western land. Western states chose parcels inside their borders as their territories when they achieved statehood. The funds raised were either entrusted to universities or held by states. Like so many other U.S. land laws, the text of the Morrill Act left out something important, the fact that these grants depended on dispossession. That went without saying. Dubiously acquired indigenous land was the engine driving the growing nation's land economy. You can point to every treaty where there's some kind of fraud, where there's some kind of coercion going on, or they're taking advantage of some extreme poverty or something like that, so they can purchase the land at rock-bottom prices, said Jameson Sweet, Lakota Dakota assistant professor in Department of American Studies at Rutgers. That kind of coercion and fraud was always present in every treaty, or in pretty much every dealing with white folk. We're great at that. The kind of coercion, fraud, hundreds of treaties, agreements, and seizures bulked up in the U.S. public domain. After surveyors carved it up into tidy tracts of real estate, settlers, speculators, corporations, and states could step in as buyers or grantees, granting pieces according to various federal laws. The first to sign on for a share of the Morrill Act bounty was Iowa in 1862, assigning the land to what later became Iowa State. Another 33 states followed during that decade, and 13 more did so by 1910. 5 states split the endowment, mostly in the South, where several historically black colleges became partial beneficiaries. Demonstrating its commitment to the separate but equal doctrine, Kentucky allotted 87% of its endowment to the white students at the University of Kentucky and 13% to the black students at Kentucky State. Not every state received land linked to the Morrill Act of 1862. Oklahoma received an agricultural college grant through other laws, located primarily in Osage and Quapaw land cessations. Alaska got some agricultural college land via pre-statehood laws, while Hawaii received a cash endowment for a land-grant college. H&C tracked down, mapped all the grants tied to the Morrill Act and overlaid them in indigenous land cessation areas in a geographic information system. The results reveal the violence of dispossession on land-grant university ledgers. So here's the Directors Guild of America. So yeah, we didn't pay anything, and there's almost $800. Here's a lovely road in the middle of nowhere, cornfield, Adams, Nebraska. Ohio State University is getting that $89. We have this lovely private residence out in Merced, California. MIT's got like $100 off of that. This real trash heap looking thing, University of Minnesota, we've almost got $1,000 and we paid $4. Pretty good deal. Consider the Dakota Cessation of 1851. 4 Dakota bands signed treaties at Mendota and Traverse de la Sioux, Minnesota, in the summer of 1851, relinquishing nearly all Dakota territory in Minnesota Makoe, the land where the waters reflect the clouds. They did so in response to the withholding of rations, the threat of violence, enforced starvation, the killing of game, and destruction of agriculture, call it coercion. The following years, Congress unilaterally altered the agreements and delayed annuity payments. Faced with crop failures and widespread graft by white traders, a Dakota faction fought back in 1862. In response, Governor Alexander Ramsey called for the extermination or exile of Dakotas and deployed U.S. Army militia units to end the so-called Dakota War. Congress would go on to abrogate Dakota treaties and expel the bands from the state, but before it did, Lincoln authorized the largest mass execution in U.S. history. In December 1862, the U.S. Army hanged 38 Dakota men for their participation in the insurrection. Less than 5 weeks later, Governor Ramby claimed Minnesota's Morrill Act windfall. So the Sisseton, the Wapton, and the Wanted sorry, Medewan Canton and Wapekute in Dakota cessation benefit the endowments of more land-grant universities than any other treaty or cessation. So they got them out of there, and then everybody managed to get all sorts of... Look at all these guys. 35 universities benefiting from one single treaty. And unfortunately, I believe there's a Michigan one in here. Michigan State. Oh, no, Michigan State is actually not in this list. But Ohio State is. So hot. All right. State land agents soon selected over 98% of Minnesota's grant and territory ceded by the Dakota in 1851. The selections covered 145 square miles, broken up into more than 300 parcels, scattered across 18 counties. It was a valuable sliver of the Dakota cessation. Appraisals pegged the land's value at between $5 and $10 per acre. By the early 20th century, sales and leases raised nearly $580,000, equivalent to more than $10.5 million today. Through the cessation of 1851, the Dakotas were paid less than 2.4 cents per acre for the same land. The state assigned the endowment to the University of Minnesota in 1868. Founded as a preparatory school in 1851, the college shuttered due to debt during the Civil War, but Dakota land brought it back to life, while the Morrill Act got the credit as the determining clause for the permanent establishment of the state university. For every dollar the United States claims to have spent to purchase the Dakota title, the Morrill Act heaped $250 into the University of Minnesota's coffers, a return of 250 to 1. Good results. As a result of exile war, many Dakota live today in communities in South Dakota, North Dakota, Nebraska, Minnesota, Saskatchewan, Montana, and Minnesota. In fiscal year 2019, the University of Minnesota's endowment was valued at $2.5 billion. But consider the wider significance of the cessation of 1851 and its grim aftermath of the National Land Grant University system. No other indigenous cessation provided more land to more universities. Nearly 830,000 acres from this treaty, an area almost 3 times the size of Los Angeles, would help fund the endowment of 35 land-grant universities. Minnesota Makato furnished 1 out of every 13 acres redistributed under the Morrill Act. And I'm probably saying that really, really wrong, and I will apologize. Okay, treaty by trailer home communities, seized by Congressional Act, this is the University of Arizona, raised like $2,000, okay. Profiting from dispossession permeates Morrill Act grants. Colorado, for instance, located nearly half of Colorado State University's grant on land taken from the Arapaho and Cheyenne less than a year after the Sand Creek Massacre of 1864, in which U.S. forces brutally murdered more than 200 members of those tribes. The 150,000 acres selected for the University of Arizona, once the home of the Pima, Yuman, Tohono, O'odham, Navajo, and Arapache, were nearly all seized without payment at the end of the Apache War and the rest of Geronimo. The University of Arizona benefited from tracts in the Grand Canyon State. Portions of grants assigned to Auburn and Pennsylvania State were redeemed from expropriated Apache lands in Arizona. So a closer look at the Morrill Act parcel on the ground in Tucson. So selected for the endowment. Apache people paid nothing. It raised like $2,000. The Apache Tears Motel was once a historic roadside stop for motorists off Benson Highway in Tucson, which featured a kitschy statue of a cross-legged Indian donning a headdress. Today, the motel offers weekly and monthly stays and is a stone's throw away from the sprawling Apache Village RV Park. So, there would be no higher education as we know it in the United States without the original and ongoing colonization of indigenous peoples and lands, just like there would be no United States, said Sharon Stein, an assistant professor at the University of British Columbia. Oh, Canadians weighing in, okay. There is no moment or time or place in an institution that is not deeply entangled with the violence of colonialism. There would be no higher education, as we know it in the United States, without the original and ongoing colonization of... see, I told you they repeat themselves. Okay, my bad. By integrating data on money paid or not for indigenous title and money raised for university endowments, it becomes possible to gain a sense of the wealth transfer filtered through the Morrill Act. Sometimes this can be relatively straightforward. All of the lands funding the University of Missouri Columbia, for instance, came from just 2 Osage treaties in 1808 and 1825. Meriwether Lewis offered the 1808 treaty to the Osage as an alternative to their extermination, while in 1825 William Clark demanded Osage land to create reservations for eastern tribes. Granted an area more than twice the size of Chicago, by the early 20th century, the University of Missouri had raised over $360,000 from land that was strong-armed from the Osage for less than $700. Today, the school still benefits from nearly 15,000 acres of unsold Morrill lands. Other instances were far more complex. Pennsylvania State University's 780,000-acre grant, for instance, came from the homelands of more than 112 tribes, including the Yakami, Menominee, Apache, Cheyenne, Arapaho, Pomo, Ho-Chunk, Sac, Fox Nation, and Klamath. The land was acquired for the United States for approximately $38,000 and included seizures without compensation. The windfall netted Penn State more than $439,000, about $7.8 million when adjusted for inflation. Penn State's grant is connected to 50 land cessations cast across 16 states. As far as the modern institutions that you know, obviously, that funding is kind of a drop in the bucket in the operation of these institutions, said Nathan Sorber. But at the time, the reason they're here, the reason they were able to weather the difficult financial times of the 19th century was because of that initial land. Oh, lovely, more buildings, kingdom halls of Jehovah's Witnesses. All right. Financial returns can be lucrative, even if states reassigned endowments from one university to another, and this was the case with Brown and Yale, which received land-grant endowments in the 1860s, but lost them to state universities in the 1890s. Brown illustrates the impressive low end of the potential benefit of expropriated indigenous lands. Assigned Rhode Island's grant in 1863, administrators at Brown first flirted with a scheme to speculate with the scrip before changing course and dumping it for 42 cents per acre in 1866. The sale brought approximately $50,000, making it the single smallest Morrill Act endowment. Still, the take was more than 10 times the amount paid to the 20 tribal nations forced from the land, while the scrip was redeemed, most importantly the Kaw Nation, which had received $179 for what became one-third of the 120,000-acre grant. In 1892, the state reassigned the grant to the University of Rhode Island, but Brown clawed back the value by taking the state to court. 2 years later, amid one of the country's worst depressions, Brown won a settlement worth about $1.2 million, adjusted for inflation. When Brown released his 2006 study of its debt to slavery, it found it impossible to measure the financial implications the slave trade had for the institution. Here, the opposite is true. Brown's Treasurer's Report, April 15, 1895, noted a credit of $40,000 for the lost grant, boosting the university's total funds by 3.5%. To increase the university's endowment by a similar percentage today would require a gift of $150 million. Yale was assigned the benefit of 180,000 acres in Morrill Act script, eventually redeemed from the former homelands of 53 tribal nations. That land was transferred to the United States through 33 ratified and unratified treaties made between 1808 and 1858. Connecticut sold the entire lot in a block in 1863 for $135,000, raised primarily at the expense of the Ojibwe and Odawa, whose lopsided land cessations contained more than 70% of what became the state's grant. Interest in the fund provided scholarships for in-state students until Connecticut reassigned the endowment to the University of Connecticut, then known as Storrs Agricultural College, in 1893. Yale went to court and later received a settlement for the full $135,000 plus interest worth about $4.8 million in today's dollars. A nice playground here in Black Hawk, University of Delaware, $80. In many places, the return for Indigenous title is incalculable because nothing was paid for the land. Often, however, the extraordinary boon to universities remains clear. Morrill Act funds for the entire endowment more than one-third of land-grant colleges a half-century after the law's passage. Such was the case at the University of Arkansas. Founded as Arkansas Industrial University in 1871, the institution benefited from almost 150,000 acres of scrip sold for $135,000 in 1872. More than 140 tribal nations had just received $966 for the same land. Behind the stark disparity lie hundreds of pieces of scrip redeemed in California where indigenous communities were hunted and exterminated. Bounties for indigenous heads and scalps, paid for by the state and the federal government, encouraged the carving up of traditional territories without any compensation. Meanwhile, 18 treaties made to secure land cessions were rejected by the Senate and kept secret for half a century by Congress. Woo, there's links there, and we should explore that later maybe. It's called genocide, admitted California Governor Gavin Newsom last year when he issued a formal apology for the dispossession and attempted destruction of tribal communities. 32 land-grant universities got a share of California and Indian land, raising approximately $3.6 million from over 1.7 million acres. Among them, one finds far-flung scrip schools like Virginia Tech, Louisiana State University, and the University of Maine. University of California located all of its grant among these stolen lands. To capitalize on its 150,000 acres, the university ran a real estate operation that sold plots on installment plans, generating a lucrative combination of principal and interest payments. In the late 19th century, income from the fund, traceable to the lands of the Miwok, Yokuts, Gabriello, I cannot roll my R, sorry, Maidu, Pomo, and many more, covered as much of a third of the University of California's annual operating expenses. Oh yeah, talk about money. By the time Ishii died in 1916, the university had sold all but 1,400 acres of its grant, and the fund was fading in relevance. From simple beginnings, one visitor marveled at the school's 50th jubilee in 1918, it has grown as if by magic. And here's some more fun maps. So land-grant universities located in states with larger congressional delegations receive more acreage, which obviously are going to be these nice people on the East Coast. That kind of makes sense. MSU is kind of in the middle here. Who received the most expropriated indigenous land by acreage is Cornell, and then Ohio State, a happy number 3. Can't even see ours in there. No Michigan. Land-grant university endowments benefiting when acreage was sold and the profits invested in, and we can see this giant bubble over here. MSU, though, did pretty gosh darn good. What endowment raised the most from indigenous land? Cornell by a long shot, but MSU is actually number 3 on this, although we didn't get as much land in Michigan. We managed to make a good amount of money off of it. Alright, despite its careful management, the University of California was not the greatest land-grant beneficiary in California. More than 250,000 acres of Cornell University's scrip were redeemed in California, most of it in the San Joaquin Valley, one of the most fertile parts and the most agriculturally productive state of the Union. Well, as Ricano founded the university with a quid pro quo, the state would kick in the land grant if he would donate $500,000 to the school. It worked, and the university's namesake lost little time supercharging the returns. He purchased most of the nearly 990,000 acres of scrip himself, speculated with it, and folded the profits back into the university. In all, Cornell raised nearly $6 million, a significantly higher profit than its nearest rivals. It would have been a bit higher, but 14 pieces of scrip were lost in the mail. Land taken from the Ojibwa, Miwok, Yokuts, Dakota, and other parties through 63 treaties or seizures. Funds were often generated so quickly the university could not keep track of the interest it was earning. Within 20 years of its founding, Cornell had the 3rd largest university endowment in the United States. A report to alumni noted in 1884 that the endowment afforded them everything the pursuit of knowledge requires and money can buy. Except apparently any recognition of the origins of the endowment. Thank you for reaching out to us on this issue. A Cornell spokesperson in response to this story. Unfortunately, I have no information to share on this issue at this time. So we have a nice little woodsy thing here. Discovery Park in Seattle. Paid $2. Managed to get $30. It remains impossible to determine who raised the largest amount principal from the Morrill lands because not all the lands have been sold. While most scrip states offloaded their land quickly, western states tend to hold on to it longer, generating higher returns. There was never a deadline to sell. Idaho, for instance, still manages an area larger than Manhattan, claimed by the United States through an 1863 treaty rejected then and now by the Nez Perce for the benefit of the University of Idaho. With over 33,000 acres of its 90,000 acre grant left unsold, as well as 70,000 acres of mineral rights, the university generated more than $360,000 in revenue in fiscal year 2019 alone. Montana State University still owns almost twice as much land as Idaho does, taken from the Blackfeet, Crow, Salish, and Kootenai, Nez Perce, Colville, and Ojibwa. In fiscal year 2019, MSU made more than $630,000 from its approximately 63,000 remaining Morrill Act acres. So 103,000 pieces, that's not too bad. Or 10,000 pieces? 10,000. Maybe I can do math. Meanwhile, Washington has retained nearly 80% of the original grant to fund Washington State University. No money was paid by the federal government to the Coeur d'Alene, Colville, Shoalwater Bay, and Chehalis tribes for land supporting WSU. The Maka, Puget Sound, Shalish, Shemakuan, Sakalam, Umatilla, and Yakama received a combined $2,700 for their land cessations. In fiscal year 2019, the remaining lands generated $4.5 million for WSU, mostly from timber harvest. Ah yes, the gift that keeps on giving. Today, more than 500,000 acres unwillingly donated by tribal nations, the land-grant colleges remain held in trust for at least 12 universities. In fiscal year 2019 alone, these lands produced more than $5.4 million in revenue for colleges. Another fun shot from Monterey Bay, Clemson, we made $20 on that. Some residential housing, we made almost $800 on that. A century after Ishii arrived at the University of California, a Lincoln impersonator hired for the Morrill Act's 150th anniversary explained how the act secured students' right to rise, Lincoln's creed. When Montana State University erected an 8-foot-tall stainless steel statue of Lincoln in 2018, the crowd fist-pumped and chanted, "Go Cats Go!" With no shores of land-grant anniversaries on the horizon, the celebrations show no sign of stopping. To be sure, land-grant universities have accomplishments to celebrate. Their researchers developed the measles vaccine, helped us get a glimpse of the black hole, and they're currently working to improve freshwater supplies for the planet. They've graduated millions of students. If it's hard to deny, the Morrill Act expanded access to higher ed, promoted economic development, and improved quality of life. It's just as hard to believe that all happened without any cost. There's a basic underlying need for settlers and settler colonial states to have these kind of mythological narratives about the benevolence of their own governments and about the progress they supposedly brought to this place, said Sharon Stein. Having a conversation with the colonial foundations of the nation states really complicates these narratives and it starts to bring into question our very right to be here and our right to make claims on this place and the institutions that we are generally so attached to. So how do you steer conversation to the facts and not the myth? Well, this is what we know. Hundreds of violence-backed treaties and seizures extinguished indigenous title to over 2 billion acres in the United States. Nearly 11 million of those acres were used to launch 52 land-grant institutions. Money has been on the books ever since, earning interest, while a dozen or more of these universities still generate revenue from unsold lands. Meanwhile, Indigenous people remain largely absent from student population, staff, faculty, and even the curriculum. In this context, Indigenous people are an inconvenient truth. If you look at the law and the treaties and you raise an existential question about the United States and its very right to be here, it's a question most people would rather ignore. Try this scenario devised by Cutcha Baldy as a way for her students to better envision the dilemma. She's Department Chair of Native American Studies at Humboldt State University in California. Imagine this. Your roommate's boyfriend comes in one day and steals your computer. He uses it in front of you, and when you point out your computer not his, he disagrees, he found it, you weren't using it, it's his. How long can you let that go? How long until you're like, never mind, I guess that's your computer now? Now imagine this is what's happened to your land. How long are we supposed to say this is the land you stole so you don't get to claim ownership of it and then feel real proud of it that you're using it for education? In fact, the evidence of Indigenous dispossession, the role of land-grant universities in that expropriation has been hiding in plain sight. Yeah, whether they realize or not, every person who's gone through 4-H owes the experience of the benefits of the land-grant system, said Barry Dunn, president of South Dakota State University, and the land-grant system has escorted the land that was provided. Another fun basketball court, bought it for nothing and sold it for less than $20. Alright, less than half the universities were contacted about the story responded, many citing COVID-19 preparations as the reason for delay, but some were ready for the conversation. At the University of Connecticut, the Native American cultural programs have begun to look into the question where the institution got its land. The topics you raised are of great interest to us here at UConn, so your timing is excellent, asking, a spokesperson said, but we have not yet taken actions to explicitly acknowledge the impact on tribal nations and communities whose lands were the source of financial resources. Let's return to Cutcha Baldy and her scenario. Now, the boyfriend of your roommate feels bad about taking your computer. He has an idea. What if you put a plaque on it and says that it belonged to you, that every time he uses it, everyone will know that it used to be your computer, it'll be his formal acknowledgement that it used to be yours. Now, how do you feel about that? So here's Baldy's take. The more work we do with decolonization and reconciliation, the more you start to realize there is no reconciliation without the return of stolen land. It doesn't work otherwise. But how would that work? There's the question of legality of broken treaties, but the bigger question is, why aren't we trying? We have to start with a discussion of what that could look like. There are some hints. The American Indian Indigenous Studies Department, Michigan State University, has incorporated language on the Morrill Act relationship to expropriation and genocide and its extended land acknowledgement. And I did look at that, and it is very well written. A little bit more about MSU than I ever wanted to know, but very thorough. Perhaps most strikingly, the Wokeney Initiative at Dakota State University has recently redirected income from its remaining Morrill acres into programming support for Native students hoping to attend SDSU. Awesome. The first step in understanding and acknowledging your history, and the second step is committing yourself to the principles on which the land-grant system was founded. And if you do those things, the answers emerge. Fiscal year 2019, Morrill land still held by South Dakota produced nearly $636,000 in revenue through the Wokeney Initiative that money now goes to Indigenous students. You can't go back and change the beginning, but you can start today and change the ending. And exciting railways. Here's $200. And we gratefully acknowledge the Wabanaki, Massachusetts, Lenape, Piscataway, Natticook, Powhatan, Kickapoo, Wichita, Numunanu, Cayuga, no Agahat, Vubobo, Puebla of Sandia, Nimipu, Palos, Tongva, Katunaxa, Shitsumos, and Dexdoabis people on whose homelands the story was created. And yes, I'm sorry if I ruined any of your people's names. I am not great at pronouncing things, even in my own native language, much less others. Alright, so good times. I will put the link, if you want to go look for it, in the description.